This is the start of Podcast 2 for Chapter 3 on Designing Learning Experiences. Organizational arrangements in physical education are the instructional arrangements of people, time, space, and equipment. Organizational arrangements should always be purposefully designed and included in the lesson plan. The teacher makes decisions about organization constantly throughout their classes about how to group people, alone, in partners, or bigger groups than that, time, how long to practice, space, where the students will work and how do you define that space for the students, and what the students will use, the equipment they will use. Will it be the same for everyone, or will you accommodate different students and their learning styles and abilities by giving them different equipment? There are also environmental arrangements to consider, whether the sun is in the eyes of the students or the teacher, it should be in the teachers, whether the wind is blowing a certain direction, etc. We should never, as teachers, underestimate the importance of the organizational or environmental arrangements in facilitating the learning of students in physical education. However, we always need to hold students accountable for their own learning. In regard to making arrangements for people in the classes, how will you put students in groups? Will it be according to equipment and content? How many students are necessary for this task? How many will be in a group, and can they do it individually or in a partner? There are also criteria for grouping, whether all the groups are made up of the same gender, the same ethnicity, the same interests, or friends of each other, social compatibility, size, by chance or random. How do you decide how they're going to be grouped, and should they be grouped in a heterogeneous way so that there are several different students in the groups of different backgrounds? Another way to group students is by ability grouping. That can be desirable for skill acquisition. Instead of making teams up of different ability levels, sometimes it would be better to choose the groups by ability and let them practice with their students that are of their same ability levels. As far as putting them into groups, sometimes we use random things like color of eyes, birthdays, and so on. Heterogeneous grouping by ability or by background is used a lot for peer teaching and for cooperative learning. Arranging time is always a challenge for teachers because of the length of time it takes to practice something and how long they stay in a learning experience. The general rule for teachers in physical education is that if 80% of the class generally are being successful at the learning task you've asked them to practice, or the movement task, then it's time to move on to the next practice task. You also need to design some learning experiences as student-paced or self-paced tasks, and sometimes they will be teacher-paced. The best example of teacher-paced is when you have stations and a teacher paces the amount of time that each of the students stays at a station. The selection of appropriate cues to help students focus on what they're learning is an example of how arranging time is important. We don't want to waste a lot of time. We want them to concentrate and focus on what we're asking them to do. One major aspect of time in a class is transitions. We need to make them smooth, efficient, and quick so that we don't waste a lot of time in moving students from one task to the next. Arranging space is probably one of the most important things that physical education teachers do. We have to define the practice area, usually by using cones or poly spots or some other type of natural boundary like a line on a basketball court. But safety is our biggest consideration. It should be your number one priority. That's why arranging space is so important. When practicing in partners or in groups of 3, we always need to make sure that the practice is going in the same direction so that students will not hit each other with balls or other implements. It's important for you to define the boundaries of the practice area, again by lines or polyspots or cones, and demonstrate that area in your introduction to the lesson and your introduction to each learning activity or learning experience that you give them. There are several formations that we use in physical education, similar to in coaching. We use the scattered formation where they spread out with an equidistance between them and anyone else around them. In squads, which are lines, lines which are shoulder to shoulder, lines which are front to back, in circles, in double lines where partners are facing each other, or in two lines where they are facing, the first person of each line is facing each other. Those organizational patterns can be found on page 51, figure 3.1. They're drawn with X's and O's just like a coach would do on a board. Because these organizational patterns are so important to teaching, you need to draw the organizational patterns for each learning experience on your Winthrop lesson plan. Of course, it is ideal to have one piece of equipment for each student or for every two students. Sometimes we have small budgets and it's easier and cheaper to ask for donations from parents and businesses and make your own equipment. Some of the teacher decisions about equipment are: should you provide students with the same equipment? Or should you give the choices to the students whether they want to get smaller or larger equipment and make the choice themselves on what they want to use for that lesson? Or do you modify the equipment used and again give them choices? The size and weight of manipulative equipment can often determine whether younger and less skilled students can be successful in performing a skill in an efficient way. Nothing is sacred about regulation-sized equipment. Transitions are the organization of students in between learning experiences, how you organize them and group them and get them arranged in between learning experiences. It has to do a lot with the time in the lesson. We want to make them as short as possible and as efficient as possible. It's one of the biggest wasters of time in physical education is transitions taking way too long because a teacher is not prepared or not organized. Transitions between learning experiences should be placed on the lesson plan in between each learning experience, an entire written out scenario for how the teacher is going to move the students from one learning experience to the next. A teacher must make strategies and plan for quick transitions in changing equipment, changing groups of practice, moving from a formal organization to a new practice area, and so on. When you have a circle or a line facing front or two lines facing, it's very convenient to find lines on the basketball court or out on the field for them to go to, or just ask them to walk over and stand next to a student and that's their new partner. Giving students a choice in who they work with, the size and type of equipment that they use, when to start or change a task, and where to work and what size of space they'll work in are very important things to do for students in this day and time with students that learn in different ways. If you give students choices, they are likely to be more responsible for their own learning, and they will learn more if they have some choice in their own learning. A skill has been effective if it accomplishes the purpose that it was used for. The efficiency of a skill is related to the mechanics or biomechanics of the skill. There is a best way of doing skills. There is not an only way of doing skills. Many people can be efficient in a skill without doing the quote-unquote proper or best mechanics. The adaptation of skills has to do with adjusting to conditions around the performance. We've already talked about closed skills in different environments, and open skills, and given examples back in Chapter 2. Again, your number one experience or priority is that all learning experiences in your classes should be safe. You need to make sure that all students have the prerequisites to do a skill in order for them to be successful. If they're successful with skills and with practice, they're likely to stay and continue to practice those skills. Do not let students work out of control on any task. If they're out of control during play or during class or during a learning experience, they're dangerous to themselves and others. Sometimes you even have to stop class if students work out of control and point out why that is a problem. You should teach students how to work safely, how to be aware of others, be aware of flying balls and obstacles and obstructions. They need to have large equipment and be aware of large equipment like bleachers and balance beams, and they also need to look at the space around them and be aware of everything that's coming in their direction. Safety considerations is a special section on the Winthrop lesson plan, and it's there because of your liability your legal liability responsibility. You need to teach students about every safety consideration for every activity that you do. All teachers, including physical education teachers especially, are required to have legal liability insurance before they teach. It is necessary as a beginning teacher and throughout your career to use best practices of physical education. You are, as the Latin phrase says, in loco parentis, you are in the place of the parent, and your welfare of your students is your number one priority. Because the nature of physical education content makes us particularly vulnerable, it's important to make sure that we do what is prudent and reasonable in all teaching situations. When we don't act according to best practice, we can be found to be negligent, and that's when liability suits usually become a part of your life. As long as you use best practice, you will be covered and you will have a good experience teaching. That's the end of Chapter 3's podcast.